This is Audible.
Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Phoenix Years, Art, Resistance, and the Making of Modern China by Madeline O'Day, narrated by Caroline McLaughlin. A note on Chinese names. Chinese names consists of a family name and a personal name. The family name is placed before the personal name. Thus, Xi Jinping's family name is Xi, and his personal name is Jinping. Chapter 1. Beijing, 1986. The meeting had not been easy to arrange. I had told him I would call him, forgetting for a moment how hard that would be. Of course, he didn't have a private phone. Who did in China back then? Riley, he gave me the number of one of the public phones at the end of his street. They were flimsy handsets perched on rickety tables outside storefronts and kiosks. You could use them for a few cents, and if you were a local, you could receive calls on them too, as long as the person who answered was willing to go down the alley to fetch you. They were just as likely to hang up, though, especially if the caller was a foreigner. After a week of listening to the line go dead, I was ready to give up. But on my final try, I heard a grunt of assent and the sound of the phone clattering onto a table. Then, as I waited, the sounds of the street. Random scraps of conversation I couldn't understand. A bicycle bell. A tubercular cough. And then it was him. We arranged to meet in 2 days' time. It was February 1986, the year of the tiger and the 8th year of China's great experiment in opening up and reform. In December 1978, Paramount leader Deng Xiaoping had begun liberalizing the Chinese economy, loosening the chokehold of collective farming on the agricultural sector, allowing a few green shoots of private enterprise, and inching open the door to Western investment. It was an experiment that over succeeding decades would lift more than 500 million people out of poverty, transform lives, and make China the second largest economy in the world. But on Beijing's bitterly cold streets that winter, signs of change were still few. People hunkered down in padded army surplus greatcoats and caps with the flaps turned down, like demobbed soldiers. The coats came in 2 colors, army green or navy blue, with brown fake fur trim and leather-look buttons. I chose the blue. I had bought a pink puffer jacket at Beijing's state-run friendship store on my arrival in January 1986, but discarded it as soon as I could. China was embracing change, it was true, but out of doors people still practiced the art of blending in. It was indoors that things were changing. Behind its age-old gray facade, Beijing was opening up. I first met him at a party at the Friendship Hotel, a sprawling compound in the west of the city where China housed what it liked to call its foreign experts. The place had been built for the Soviet advisors who poured into China after the founding of the People's Republic in 1949. But the 2 communist behemoths had quarreled and split in the 1960s, and now the hotel buzzed with Westerners. French, Italian, American, Canadian, British, Australian, New Zealanders, drawn in by Deng Xiaoping's open-door policy. The experts were people who had, or claimed to have, skills the country needed: teachers, technical specialists, business advisors, and a whole United Nations worth of polishers who labored to smooth out the clotted language of translated texts in foreign language propaganda magazines like China Reconstructs, or in the mind-numbing news items issued hourly from the new China news agency, Xinhua. I was writing for the Australian Financial Review at the time, but unlike other foreign journalists who were housed alongside diplomats in the center of the city, I was lucky enough to be living with the experts, who worked side by side with Chinese colleagues and whose Friendship Hotel was just streets away from the country's leading universities. In the 1980s, the Chinese Authority did everything they could to keep foreigners and locals apart. The compounds for diplomats and journalists were strictly policed, and any Chinese person gaining entry had their identity card checked, recorded, and passed back to authorities, a big deterrent to casual contact. In theory, the same was true for the Friendship Hotel, but there was a whiff of anarchy about everything that happened there, and with the least bit of sang-froid, a young Chinese walking arm in arm with a foreigner could enter the gates with anonymity intact. A Westerner in a taxi could ferry a whole carload of Chinese friends into the grounds without trouble. By the time I arrived in January 1986, the Friendship Hotel was at the center of Beijing's burgeoning bohemia, There were no rules about who could talk to whom. There were no off-limit topics, and a Chinese person who hung around after the sun went down on a Saturday could be drawn into the hotel's most celebrated attraction, a Western-style party. You didn't need an invitation. You just shouldered your way into the room, along with aspiring artists, writers, poets, musicians, students, teachers, experts, journalists, and diplomats, to drink Beijing beer and brightly colored alcoholic punch, to dance to eclectic mixtapes on a Sony Walkman hooked up to cheap speakers, and to discuss anything from the necessity of Nietzsche to the sexiness of the Chinese women's volleyball team, while falling quickly and sometimes falling hard for whoever you found yourself drinking with. We were at the halfway mark of a decade that would take us from the dawn of open China to the tragedy of Tiananmen Square in 1989. But at that moment, no one knew where the limits would be, or where this heady road was taking us. On that Saturday at the Friendship Hotel, it was his girlfriend I noticed first. She caught my eye with an abbreviated striptease that took her from army greatcoat to skinny black ski suit to mini dress in just 2 fluid movements. She wore the only kind of stockings available in China back then, the ones that stopped disappointingly at the knee. But the black stilettos she took out of her bag made up for that. Her boyfriend wore his bag with the strap diagonally across his body and held tightly to his side. He was carrying something more precious to him than a change of shoes. It was a collection of photographic slides. He was a painter, and these were images of his work. This was how I got to see Chinese contemporary art for the first time, on transparencies drawn, one by one, from a battered plastic sleeve and held up to a dim ceiling light at the Friendship Hotel. I remember peering at the first image, preparing to be kind. Within the tiny cardboard frame, figures floated free, male and female, naked, untethered from ground and sky. These weren't recycled classical images or the socialist realism of Chinese official art, but something personal to the man in front of me, with his longish hair and weathered skin, in his early 20s like me, yet seeming much older and younger at the same time. People were dancing to Talking Heads' Life During Wartime. It was our anthem that year. But as I looked at these images, I seemed to hear the words for the first time. As David Burns said, this wasn't just a party and we weren't just fooling around. I could see dozens of strange groupings around the room, discussing the interpretation of dreams and Bob Dylan, Astro Boy and Kurosawa, misty poetry and the banned ideas of a Taiwanese writer called Bo Young, who had skewered what he called the ugly Chinaman. You could see the young diplomat falling for the aspiring punk rocker, the California gym instructor captivating the seemingly stitch-up cadre from the think tank, the poet looking on indulgently as his wife schemed her escape to the West with the foreign expert she'd just met, the scholar gratefully slipping into his bag a still-banned book about Western economics. You could see how the ground was shifting under Chinese society, how changes were beginning to play out that the country's leader had never planned for and might not be able to control, no matter how desperately they tried. But on the afternoon I arranged to meet him, as my taxi carried me along Chang'an, the Avenue of Eternal Peace, the capital's main artery. The city seemed as placid as ever. Around us streams of bicycles flowed along, and as I passed the Minzu Hotel, its clock tower blared out, as it did on the hour every day, a plaintive, synthesized version of "The East is Red," the hymn of praise to Chairman Mao that every Chinese citizen knew. The East is red, the sun rises. From China arises Mao Zedong. He strives for the people's happiness. Hurrah! He is the people's great savior. We passed directly under the eyes of Mao's portrait on Tiananmen Gate, before turning south into unknown territory and stopping on the fringe of the old neighborhood of Xuanwoman, where he waited for me. He led me along a dog-legging route through the 15th century alleyways that were the lacework holding old Beijing together. Hutongs, as they were called, defined China's old capital. Their gray stone walls pierced at intervals by weathered wooden doors that opened onto four-sided courtyard houses. Each of these once housed a single extended family, but now they were run by Communist Party neighborhood committees who allocated every square meter with relentless efficiency. We walked past all the signs of the communal life of his neighborhood, heaps of cabbages preserved under quilts in the winter cold, the public bathhouse with its smell damped by the chill air, a man selling tomatoes and scallions from a cloth spread on the ground. We stepped through a wooden entranceway into a cramped courtyard. Tucked into the far corner was his home, a single undivided space where he could cook, sleep, and paint. Water came from the public bathhouse up the street. For warmth, there was a coal-burning black metal stove which flew to the outside. At the right of the room was a tiny kitchen area, just a bench with 2 gas burners. 2 large enamel basins stood on the floor, one filled with water, the other with dishes, both decorated with a symbol for double happiness. The single light, a bulb on a wire strung across the ceiling from the outside, was already on. The bed was pushed up against the far wall, converted by a colored cloth into a day sofa, and flanked by a high shelf on which stood a pile of art books and newspapers, a stuffed toy, and a small Italian flag. A finished canvas hung above the bed, while a stack of others leant against the wall under a shelf. Beside them stood a table crowded with tubes of oil paint, brushes in a jar, and a piece of board serving as a palette. A minute after we arrived, his girlfriend returned with 2 bottles of Beijing beer and a pocket-sized bottle of a lethal Chinese spirit called ergoto. We drank our beer from glasses emblazoned with the logo of the Coca-Cola Company and with the ideograms for its Chinese name, Coca-Cola. Every foreign brand that launches in China seeks name characters that are the perfect blend of euphony and good fortune, and Coca-Cola had nailed it. "It's tasty," said the name, "and it's fun." I sat in one of the 2 chairs and faced the bed, studying the canvas on the wall. It showed 3 elongated figures rising through the painting, their pale backs to us, their dark heads bowed. They seemed to have just left the ground and were half climbing, half floating up a wall of russet red paint. They were caught in the act of breaking free from Earth, but seemed lost too, as if drifting into outer space. My friend sat smoking with his left hand under his right to catch the ash, while his girlfriend shared their single ashtray with me. 30 years have passed since that evening, but I can still feel the warmth of that room, smell the coal dust and oil paint, taste the watery beer and strong cigarettes, remember the excitement of being somewhere that, as a journalist, I wasn't expected to be. By the end of that evening, I knew I had stumbled upon something that would be important to me, something that had previously been no more than an interesting sidelight to what I had come to China to write about. I was there for the big story, how the opening up of China was revolutionizing its economy, the growth of free enterprise, the smashing of the iron rice bowl of assigned jobs, and a home for life that had previously protected workers, and, most of all, the supercharged Chinese version of the Industrial Revolution, which was transforming the lives and landscapes of hundreds of millions of people. As development picked up speed, I was at times breathless at the scope and scale of the changes I was privileged to witness. Looking back, though, it is obvious that what was happening beneath the surface, in people's private lives, was just as revolutionary. My 2 new friends were bohemians, but they were also pioneers. They had chosen to live the most marginal of existences. By dropping out of school and work, they had cast themselves adrift from the web of support systems that came with a designated work unit, housing, healthcare, pensions, a recognized place in the world. And they were unmarried, living in what was then an almost unheard-of arrangement that drew official disapproval and a measure of real risk. Just a few years before, in 1983, elements of the Communist Party, spooked by the bourgeois notions that were slipping through the economic open door, had launched an official campaign against spiritual pollution. It was mercifully short but brutal, arbitrary and frightening while it lasted. One never knew when another deadly ideological outburst like it might occur again, turning lovers into criminals and artists into saboteurs. And yet here were my friends, determined to make a big life for themselves in this tiny room. They weren't alone. All across the city there were rooms like this, some more comfortable, some less, brightly colored private worlds where people drank and discussed, read, painted and wrote poetry, and dreamt up ways to burrow into the cracks that were opening up in society in pursuit of a new world. The economic transformation I was following was momentous, but what was happening in those small rooms was momentous too. It may have seemed just personal, a choice to drop out of school and paint pictures about feelings, or to wear a miniskirt and take up smoking, or to set up together as an unmarried couple and stake a claim to a private life away from the meddling of Chinese Byzantine systems of social control. But the sum of such individual choices can drive group politics more effectively than public propaganda, just as the architects of the anti-spiritual pollution campaign feared. 3 years after I sat in their home drinking beer in Ergatol, one of my 2 new friends would be helping wheel a plaster replica of the Statue of Liberty into Tiananmen Square at the height of the 1989 democracy protests, while the other watched events unfold from self-imposed exile in Australia. When that moment came, China's government seemed perched on a precipice. How had it come to this? The truth is, Deng's reforms were a calculated gamble driven by dire necessity. In 1978, 30 years after the founding of the People's Republic, China was still mired in poverty. Early economic gains by the new communist government were destroyed by Mao's fantasy of a great leap forward in industrial production, which plunged the country into a famine that killed between 36 and 45 million people between 1958 and 1962. Then, still staggering from this blow, Chinese society was torn apart by the Cultural Revolution, 1966 through 1976, when the economy was all but paralyzed, universities closed, millions were forcibly displaced, and at least 1.7 million people died, either directly through persecution or by starvation. By 1978, China's per capita GDP was no bigger than Afghanistan's and 1/6 that of Brazil. Most galling of all, Japan, which had humiliated China for 40 years and invaded it in 1937 before crashing to a defeat that left it a smoking ruin in 1945, was now the world's second-largest economy. The Maoist project had failed and things had to change. In truth, Deng had no grand plan when he began the reform process. Famously pragmatic, he called his gradualist approach crossing the river by feeling the stones. But he certainly intended China to stay firmly within Communist Party control. Reform would be about development, not liberalization. No doubt he knew there would be risks, but whatever he planned for, he couldn't have envisaged that just 10 years after he launched his policy, the Chinese government would be facing a popular movement that would bring millions to demonstrate in the heart of the capital. As that protest movement grew in the spring of 1989, those who believed that democracy would inevitably follow economic development saw their day of vindication coming. But China never follows the script that others write for it. The Chinese government survived the challenge by suppressing the protest movement with a savage military action that saw hundreds, perhaps thousands, cut down by the country's own People's Liberation Army. At the end of a year that saw almost every other communist regime in the world fall, China's government emerged more in control than ever. It was a victory, but it came at a cost. Western democracies were horrified, and for the next few years, China was an international pariah. More serious, though, was the impact on the Chinese citizens who had been caught up in the mood of optimism that had swept the country in 1989, that is, a large section of China's urban class. Few of them had thought of overthrowing the regime. They were loyal to the ideals of the revolution, and during the democracy protests, they had nursed an uninformed vision of a more open, participatory society. The crushing of the movement flung many of them into a period of disillusion, apathy, and depression, which finally hardened into a cynicism that still runs through China's society today. Since 1989, China has pursued a course that many observers in the 1980s, both Chinese and foreign, believed would be impossible: a course of economic development without democratic reform. The Chinese Communist Party, for all its challenges today, still seems unassailable, even though there is now a large private space in which Chinese people can live and express themselves without the state impinging. The reforms launched by Deng have transformed China economically, socially, and culturally. The lives of hundreds of millions of people have been forever changed, but the huge scale of these changes can make them particularly hard to grasp. Certainly you can track them in statistics. The biggest trading nation in the world, the second largest economy on Earth, a one-time peasant nation in which a majority now live in cities. You can see them, too, written across the faces of China's great cities, in the sprawl of Beijing, with its supersized buildings and toxic air, growth spiraling out from its historic heart in ring road after ring road choked with cars, or in the sparkling neon glamour of Shanghai, reveling in its renewed claim to be the Paris of the East, or in the teeming anthill that is now the manufacturing powerhouse of Guangzhou, which has all but submerged what was once a rural province, turning farmers into factory workers and fields into gated housing estates. During this whole wild journey, from the earliest phase of economic reform and the open-door policy to today, the country's artists have vividly tracked its course, but they have not simply been spectators. Looking back, what is striking is how closely intertwined the processes of artistic and economic awakening were for China. When Deng launched his reforms at the end of 1978, Beijing was full of young people returned to the city from the countryside, where they had been rusticated during the Cultural Revolution. They were determined to make up for lost time. In the late autumn and winter of 1978 through 1979, despite the bitter cold, crowds started gathering at the wall just west of Tiananmen Square. There, people posted their thoughts, ideas, complaints, and manifestos, so many and diverse that this nondescript patch of urban territory soon earned itself the name Democracy Wall. One day in late December 1978, a group of young people pedaled up to the Democracy Wall with mimeographed copies of the first issue of their self-published literary magazine, Today. The 300 copies of that first painstaking print run sold out immediately, and although it contained poems by writers who would later be acknowledged as the most important of their generation, it was the magazine's cover as much as its contents that drew people to it. The word Today was emblazoned at the top in Chinese and English, and below were the silhouetted figures of a young man and woman leaning forward as if breasting the tape at the end of a race. What struck people most was the daring choice of color. The orthodox Maoist choice would have been red and white, but the young designer had chosen blue. One woman who saw it that day recalls that it was as if the magazine had fallen to earth from another world. Why blue? It's the color of the sky, the designer told me 30 years later, and to him it meant freedom without limits. His name was Huang Rui. Sent to Inner Mongolia during the Cultural Revolution, he had returned to the capital with a dream of becoming an artist. He was sent to a leather factory instead, but banded together with some friends to create Today, and just a few months later, he organized the first exhibition of Chinese contemporary art ever to be held in the country. For nearly 4 decades, China's artists have held up a mirror to their age, but they have not just reflected history. They have lived and breathed it too. In each succeeding decade, a new wave of young artists has made art out of the dreams, hopes, excitements, reversals, contradictions, and disappointments of their times. In the 1980s, they reveled in a promise of infinite space and possibility, a society whose horizons could only expand. In the 1990s, they dealt with a post-Tiananmen weight of despair and cynicism, and a new world in which money was the only guarantee of freedom. In the 2000s and beyond, a generation of artists who have only known the years since Deng's reforms have explored the fallout from decades of growth and change, the new relations between the classes and the sexes, the rich and the poor, the country and the city, environmental degradation, globalism, and a renewed desire to define what it means to be Chinese. When I think about how to relate the history of this period, I think of these generations of artists and the picture of China they have painted, not just in their work, but in their lives as well. I think of the best-selling artist whose teenage years were overshadowed by the Cultural Revolution and his mother's mental illness, who enrolled in art school at the dawn of the Chinese avant-garde and went on to create soulful images after 1989 that remain among the most iconic works of Chinese contemporary art today. I think of another whose older sister died of starvation during the Great Leap Forward and who joined the army to escape his poverty, who survived a war thanks to his flair for painting propaganda for the troops, who was talent spotted to study art in the capital and achieved success, only to be exiled for refusing to forget what he'd seen in Beijing in June 1989. I think of another who rallied in Tiananmen Square with fellow students that spring, overwhelmed with excitement and hope, who left the country in despair after June 4th, having performed one last desperate self-destructive act, and yet, despite it all, returned to live and work in Beijing, seeking in all his works to honor the spirit of the companions of his youth. I think of the artist whose father created sculptures in tribute to Chairman Mao, who herself documents the dreams of factory workers and creates online fantasy worlds for everyone to live in, where Tiananmen Square is turned into a swimming pool and Confucius is swept away in a flood. I think of another who, as a boy, played in a wasteland of decommissioned factories in China's frozen north, who dreamt of building rockets and making art, while his parents and all the adults he knew got laid off, and who grew up to find a success his family could barely understand, while his hometown rose again to claim a place as a center of foreign trade. I think of the one born in a desert oasis on what was once the Silk Road, whose works shimmer like mirages, saturated with the colors and images of a way of life that resists the development that threatens to crush it. I think of the one born in Lhasa, who studied in Beijing and embraced it as a second home, and yet eventually was driven to take the road to Dharamsala, who found success in faraway London and New York, but dreams that one day soon he will return home to Tibet. I think of the one whose feet are tattooed with leopard spots, who dreams of being a punk rocker, but who nonetheless makes art that aches with the frustrated idealism of her generation and nostalgia for a China that is slipping away. And I think of the designer who decided to create a blue cover for a poetry magazine in 1978 and went on to form a group of artists called the Stars, who later turned an abandoned military factory into a safe zone for art, who has seen his work criticized and banned, who has been evicted from his studio as a troublemaker, only to create a new haven for himself less than a kilometer away, and who, through it all, persists with his work as if the most extravagant ideals of his youth are still within his grasp. In this book, I have braided these and other stories into an account of the last 4 decades in China, told not as economics nor as politics, but as an emotional history of one of the most momentous periods of change the world has ever seen, written in the lives of artists like these, a group of people who have made it their life's work to see their country clearly. As I set out to tell their stories, the Hutan home where I sat with my 2 friends that late winter day in 1986 is gone, bulldozed in the great clearance of the capital's historic districts in the early 1990s. Their old district is now just another boulevard of malls, hotels, and restaurants, with cascading walls of glass and light, beautiful by night, but exposed and dusty by day. Both of my friends now hold foreign passports. One lives abroad, but the other, the artist, has returned to live in one of the sprawling art villages that now ring Beijing. The Friendship Hotel has been renovated for foreign visitors, and the experts have long gone. It is a place to broker the kinds of deals that only those with the best connections can bring off. Foreigners and Chinese can now party together in the thousands of bars that are spread throughout the capital. But some things haven't changed. Mao's portrait still hangs above the gate to the Forbidden City. And every day, the East is Red still marks the hours on Chang'an Avenue. Chapter 2. I Do Not Believe. In 1978, on a late spring day in the heart of Beijing, a nervous young man called Huang Rui closed the door of his bedroom and asked a young woman to strip to the waist. He was 25, but having grown up in the puritanical world of Mao's China, he had never seen a woman naked in his life. He was standing in his family home, a run-down house at one corner of a dusty courtyard wrapped within a gray maze of hutongs that encircled the historic center of the capital. She stood barely an arm's length from him in a room where he had first closed his door against his parents and the outside world. Between them stood a canvas, patched together out of 4 pieces of cloth, primed and ready to be painted. They looked at each other. She saw a bookish young man with thick-rimmed glasses and pale features apparently untouched by the 5 years he had spent in the far reaches of Inner Mongolia, toiling in the cause of Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution. He saw a woman from another age, stripped to the waist and triumphant. She was a vision of freedom guiding a victorious people out of a time of tragedy. She was Eugene Delacroix's 1830 painting, Liberty Leading the People Come to Life. He worked in the leather factory, she on a construction gang building roads. Together, they were going to cross the line. 2 years before, in April 1976, Huang Rui had witnessed the beginning of a revolution on a rainy spring day in Tiananmen Square. Today, the Tiananmen Massacre of June 4th, 1989, looms so large that it blocks out memories of earlier risings on that patch of ground. But what took place in the spring of 1976, when tens of thousands of ordinary Beijingers flocked to the square to mourn the death of Premier Zhou Enlai, only to be violently dispersed, proved a turning point for China. Anger over decades of wasted hope and blighted dreams boiled over, presaging both the fall of the Gang of Four That coterie of hardline communists, including Mao's wife Jiang Qing, who had helped steer Mao's Cultural Revolution, and the start of a new era for the country under the leadership of Deng Xiaoping. But on the spring day that Huang Rui invited the young woman into his bedroom, the impact of those events in 1976, just 2 years earlier, was still unclear. The officially approved verdict of history was that it had been a counter-revolutionary revolt, and those involved had either been deluded or criminal. But he knew it had not been like that. He had been there. On the evening of April 3rd, 1976, Huang Rui had left his job at the Beijing No. 3 leather products factory and had headed with one of his workmates for Tiananmen Square. It was 2 days before the festival known as Qingming, pure brightness, the day on which the Chinese traditionally honor their dead. Premier Zhou Enlai had died that January after a 4-year battle with cancer. He had long been seen as one of the few good men in the country's communist regime, one who had done his best to mitigate the excess of the Cultural Revolution, which had raged across the country for the previous 10 years. A grand state funeral had been held for the elite in the Great Hall of the People in January, but the Qingming Festival gave ordinary Beijingers their chance to mourn. In the days before the festival on April 5th, people came in the thousands to Tiananmen Square, the heart of the capital and its natural meeting point. They carried flowers and wreaths, banners and placards, and heaped them around the carved granite base of the monument to the people's heroes, which stood at the center of the square. The monument, a tall obelisk surrounded by revolutionary sculptures and inscribed with the calligraphy of Mao Zedong, stands opposite the Gate of Heavenly Peace, Tiananmen, on top of which Mao had stood, with Zhou beside him, to proclaim the founding of the People's Republic of China on October 1st, 1949. Those who came to the square in 1976 carried tributes of mourning, not just for Zhou, but for the ideals a monument had been built to celebrate, the dream of a republic truly dedicated to the people's welfare, a dream which, less than 3 decades after its birth, lay in ruins. On those early April days in 1976, the monument floated in a sea of flowers and placards, posters and poems. There were expressions of grief, but also of anger. Some, in a clear reference to Mao, proclaimed that the emperor's rule was over. Others called for a return to genuine communism. The crowd ebbed and flowed across the square, stopping to listen as people stepped up to speak. Through the rainy streets to the square, Huang Rui carried a poem he had written called The People's Grief. When he arrived at the monument, he decided to read it out loud. As Huang Rui began, he was scared, but he was excited too. Something wonderful was happening in the square that day. People were expressing how they felt, something they had not dared to do for years. When he finished reading, he heard a voice calling from the back of the crowd, "Read it again." He knew the cry might have come from an agent of the secret police, offering him more rope to hang himself with. Nonetheless, he read it again. As he finished, he let his workmate drag him away, but not before he had posted this poem among the others on the base of the monument. Anxious to avoid being followed, they hurried from the square, changing buses multiple times before arriving home late that evening. When the Qingming Festival dawned, Huang Rui's poem was gone, along with every other expression of the people's sorrow and anger. Not a scrap of paper was left, or a flower. China's hardline leadership, meeting in an anxious session on the night of April 4th, saw these tributes as a direct challenge to their rule. To allow them to remain at the center of the capital, on the same square where Mao had rallied his Red Guards at the start of his great proletarian cultural revolution, was insupportable. By the time a new wave of mourners came to the square on April 5th, the police had scrubbed the place clean. The leadership of the People's Republic had successfully rewritten history many times before, but on this day, the Beijingers who came upon the sanitized scene would not accept it. Thousands rallied in anger, and soon more than 100,000 people were milling in the square. Police cars were set on fire, and government buildings bordering the square were breached. As evening drew on, many were induced to leave by the veiled threats in the public broadcasts, which boomed in a continuous loop across the square. In the familiar tones of Beijing party leader Wu Dou, it warned those gathered there not to be duped by bad elements intent on counter-revolutionary sabotage. But a small group decided to stay. At 10 p.m., the security forces moved in and used batons and clubs to beat the crowd into submission. It was later announced that hundreds had been arrested, but others estimated that more than 1,000 people were taken into custody that day. They were later convicted in mass trials or sent to camps devoted to reform through labor. There were also reports of deaths that night which even now cannot be confirmed. Years later, shortly after the Tiananmen massacre of 1989, an old soldier reminisced to a young former student about the day he hosed Tiananmen Square clean of blood. "Don't worry," he said hastily to the angry young man. "I don't mean in 1989, I mean in 1976. Meanwhile, the vice premier of China, Deng Xiaoping, who was suspected of having supported the demonstrations, was stripped of all his posts. Deng had already suffered exile earlier in the Cultural Revolution. Now he found himself once more on the wrong side of history, as the hardliners around Mao prevailed. As for Huang Rui, he escaped arrest on Qingming Day, having steered clear of the square. But soon he came under investigation. The authorities printed 400 copies of his poem and issued it in the form of an arrest warrant. By the middle of the month, he had been detained at his workplace. He was still being held there more than 3 months later, when on July 28th, a devastating earthquake struck 160 kilometers north of Beijing at the city of Tangshan. The official toll was 242,000 killed and 164,000 seriously injured, but the early reports from the area ranged as high as 3 times as many. A city that was home to 1.6 million people was sucked from the map as hundreds of thousands of buildings collapsed. The quake was felt 740 kilometers away in the ancient capital of Xi'an, and in Beijing, buildings swayed and cracked. In the face of such a tragedy, the whole country was pressed into the cause of recovery and rebuilding. Huang Rui's factory could no longer waste resources supervising just one man, and he was released. The crackdown on the Qingming demonstrators in April 1976 would prove to be the last bloody act of Mao's reign. The Tangshan earthquake signaled a change of era, as such natural disasters had traditionally been thought to do. On September 9th, at the end of a boiling hot summer, Mao Zedong died. The man who had led China's communists to power and who had proclaimed the People's Republic some 27 years before. The person who had transformed the country and then led it into the serial disasters of the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution was dead. Less than a month later, Mao's wife, Jiang Qing, and the other members of the Gang of Four were under arrest. The fall of these four, who at their subsequent trial were held responsible for all the excesses of the Cultural Revolution and for other crimes which might more properly have been laid at Mao's door, at first seemed to cement the power of the chairman's chosen successor, the colorless Hua Guofeng, who had expertly sidelined his only true competition, Deng Xiaoping. But Hua didn't understand how fundamentally the Cultural Revolution had changed China. After years of chaos, it simply wasn't possible to return to the old rhetoric. When he announced that he would be guided in government by the two whatevers, whatever policy decisions Mao had made and whatever instructions the great man had given, Hua's moral authority began to unravel. His time at the top was brief. Within 2 years, Deng Xiaoping would force him into an early retirement. Even before that happened, people in the countryside had started taking matters into their own hands. In both the desperately poor eastern region of Anhui and the fertile central province of Sichuan, farmers had begun to work their own private plots of land, turning their backs on Mao's communes. A new provincial leader in Sichuan, Zhao Ziyang, an economic reformer who was to ascend to the presidency in the 1980s, let the farmers have their heads and directed that 15% of the communal land could now be farmed privately. State industries were also freed from strict control. The results of these once heretical policies were startling. Grain production jumped by a quarter, and industrial production soared. Other signs of change soon appeared. Deng Xiaoping returned to Beijing in 1977, and in the same year, the academics, scientists, and professionals who had been banished during the Cultural Revolution also returned and the universities reopened. The rehabilitation of hundreds of thousands who had fallen foul of Mao's radical agenda had begun. Like many in Beijing, Huang Rui was restlessly reading the signs. He had just been 16 when he was sent to Inner Mongolia in 1969, one among millions of teenagers who, by Mao's decree, would be re-educated in the countryside. In that bleak landscape, he had finally lost his faith in the party and their great helmsman, Chairman Mao. It was there, too, that he resolved that he would make his future as an artist. Huang Rui had studied Chinese painting as a child, learning the basics of ink and wash at the age of 11. But in the Inner Mongolian capital, Hohhot, he discovered an ethnic Mongolian painter who lived under a house arrest, but welcomed the young man who stole time to visit him and learn about oil paints. In Inner Mongolia, Huang Rui also met a young poet called Beidao, who was trying to create a new poetry, much as Huang Rui was looking for a new language of painting. On his sanctioned trips home to Beijing, Huang Rui sought out books on Western art. His choices were pretty limited, as the Impressionists and all who came after them were banned. Even so, the Western art he uncovered was a revelation for him. He sketched out exercises in anatomy and perspective in a small plastic-covered notebook that he carried with him everywhere. The pages became crowded with drawings of muscled limbs, with calculations of perspective and compositions, all sharing the faint ruled pages with poems and diary entries recording his days in a lonely landscape far from home. When he finally returned to Beijing for good in 1974, it was as a factory worker, assigned to the Beijing No. 3 leather products factory. But whatever the state might decree, he was already an artist, if passion and determination meant anything at all. He thought that there must be many people like himself in the capital, kids who had grown up in the ideological straitjacket of the Cultural Revolution, but who were now disillusioned and determined to find a way of making their own destiny. In April 1976 on Tiananmen Square, he saw thousands of them in action. They were driven underground again afterwards, but he knew now they were out there. A few months later, in a library tucked behind Beihai Park in the center of Beijing, he found an image that could honor their cause. In an old book of Western painting, he came on a reproduction of Delacroix's Liberty Leading the People. Sublimely romantic, the work depicted liberty as a beautiful bare-breasted woman brandishing the flag of the French Revolution as she urged the people to fight on even as the bodies of the fallen were heaped around her. Suddenly, Huang Rui saw a way of depicting the events of spring 1976 in Tiananmen Square, of reimagining the people's defeat as a victory, with the figure of a woman leading the crowd and standing as a rejection of everything that had gone before. As soon as he met her, Huang Rui knew she was what he needed. She was tall and strong, beautiful and restless. He had met her through Beidao, the radical poet who had befriended him in Inner Mongolia. The best friend of Beidao's young cousin, she was on the fringes of Huang Rui's band of friends, an alumni of the Cultural Revolution, all on edge for change. The daughter of doctors, her education thwarted by the Cultural Revolution, she now worked as a laborer on a road gang. When he told her what he wanted, she didn't hesitate. It was the spring of 1978, 4 years since Huang Rui had returned home, 2 years since he had joined the Qingming demonstrations in Tiananmen Square in April 1976. On a warm spring day, she came to his house, and he took her to his bedroom. He had assembled a canvas out of scraps that he had scrounged and primed with glue, 1 meter by 1.2 meters of rough cloth on which they planned to make their own version of history. Even 35 years later, Huang Rui blushed when he tried to describe to me how he felt that day, seeing a woman naked for the first time, weighing the danger of painting an event that was condemned as criminal, knowing that even to paint a nude body was forbidden. Excitement, embarrassment, fear, exhilaration, relief. Relief that they were brave enough to see the line they were crossing and step across together. They worked through the warm days of spring in the small room heady with the smell of turpentine. He was working from instinct. He had never seen a real Western painting or attended an art class, but his Mongolian mentor in Hohat had passed on the techniques of oil painting he himself had learned from Russian instructors in the 1950s. Huang Rui mixed the paints, cool, sad grays, blues and greens, and the warm colors of flesh and light. His composition was focused on the monument to the people's heroes, around which the demonstrators had gathered in 1976. In his painting, the monument would seem to split apart as his version of liberty rose through the center of the frame, while below, a new monument seemed to coalesce, made of the uplifted, pensive faces of the demonstrators. On a spring day in 2013, he showed the painting to me. He had titled it April 5, 1976, for the date of the demonstration all those years ago. He traced the joins where the pieces of canvas had been glued together, criticized his brushstrokes and naive technique. In September 1979, he had hung it on the railings outside the National Art Museum of China as part of the first-ever exhibition of contemporary art in the country. Now Hong Kong Museum wanted it for their collection, and he had finally consented to sell it. I asked him what had become of the girl in the painting. He said he wasn't sure. They had become lovers, but when she wanted to get married, she frightened me away. He laughed. To him, it seemed at odds with the bravery that had brought them together. I thought, but did not say, that marriage might have seemed to her another route to freedom. Just a few months after Huang Rui finished his painting, in late autumn of 1978, it was announced that the official verdict on the Tiananmen demonstrations of 1976 had been reversed. What had been condemned in 1976 as a counter-revolutionary riot was now rebadged as a display of patriotism. The news traveled through Beijing like a shockwave. It was as if they were finally being given permission to breathe again. And breathe they did. If you wanted to portray the history of the People's Republic of China with a diagram, one way to do it would be to draw a waveform across the page, a series of peaks and troughs, like the image on an oscilloscope. Each peak would be a period of freedom and openness, each trough a crackdown, often a savage one by the government. One of the most famous of the upswings is the Democracy Wall period in the northern autumn and winter of 1978 through 1979. Just west of Tiananmen Square, near the busy intersection with the bustling street of Xidan, was a low gray wall that didn't seem to belong to anyone. It ran for around 200 meters from the intersection, set well back from the street on the north side of Chang'an Avenue. A number of bus routes stopped nearby, and its gray expanse had long been a place where people would post small ads and notices, confident that they would be seen by scores of passerby. From spring of 1978, people had occasionally risked posting more daring texts on the wall, and around the city it became known as a place where you could catch a rare glimpse of free speech. But when the news broke that the verdict on the Qingming demonstrations had been reversed, overnight the wall became a kind of massive social media site, its bricks covered in paste and paper and hand-inked calligraphy, as people with no access to airwaves or the official press plastered up handmade posters proclaiming their hopes, their criticisms, their appeals for justice, and their idea about the path China should now take. Night after night, the pavement beside the wall thronged as hundreds and then thousands of people gathered to discuss the posters in open forums, debating everything from the separation of powers to the rising price of dumplings, condemning the Cultural Revolution and, daringly, Mao himself, calling for freedom and for the Communist Party to become a true servant of the people. All of Huang Rui's friends came to the wall, and most of his workmates, too. His girlfriend, the goddess of liberty, joined the crowd, now modestly bundled in a blue padded army coat against the cold. Beidao made his way there, too, even though he was still exiled to a job far from the capital. The crowd was full of people their age, former Red Guards who had been blessed by Mao in the early days of the Cultural Revolution for their adolescent revolutionary fervor, only to be rewarded with years of exile far from home. But the crowd was not limited to the young or to the educated or even to the urban. People came from the countryside also armed with petitions. Whole families arrived, from grandparents to babies in arms. Just a few hundred meters down Chang'an were the red walls of the Forbidden City, and next to it, Zhongnanhai, the new Forbidden City where China's leadership all lived. There was no reaction from those quarters. Did silence mean acquiescence? As one of the bitterest winters in years closed in, the posters and discussions became more daring until one day in early December 1978, a young man called Wei Jingsheng, a former soldier who had worked as an electrician at the Beijing Zoo, posted the most famous manifesto ever to cover the gray bricks of what had become known as Democracy Wall. He called it the Fifth Modernization. To us, the title seems prosaic, but to those gathered at the wall, it was incendiary. For years, China's leader had been declaring that to grow and be strong, the country needed to pursue the modernization of agriculture, industry, national defense, and science and technology. Even the recently rehabilitated and soon-to-be ascendant national leader Deng Xiaoping had nailed his colors to the mast of the four modernizations. And now this young man was arguing that all four would amount to nothing without a fifth modernization, democracy. You do not need to be an expert in Chinese history to appreciate the power of the fifth modernization. It is one of the most electrifying political polemics ever written, as stirring as any of the writings of the architects of the French or American revolutions. The people should have democracy, Wei wrote. When they call for democracy, they are demanding nothing more than that which is inherently theirs. Whoever refuses to return democracy to them is a shameless thief, more despicable than any capitalist who robs the workers of the wealth earned with their own sweat and blood. Democracy, freedom, and happiness for all are our sole objectives in carrying out modernization. Without this fifth modernization, all other modernizations are nothing but a new promise. He wrote that the time for slogans was over and that the people should not be fooled again. I urge everyone to stop believing such political swindlers. When we all know we are going to be tricked, why don't we trust ourselves instead? The Cultural Revolution has tempered us, and we are no longer so ignorant. Let us investigate for ourselves what should be done. Even today, it is exhilarating to read what Ray wrote over a single winter's night in 1978. We are so used to hearing the argument that democracy is a Western concept to which China isn't suited, so used to nodding at the Chinese government's assertion that without a single party to run things, the country would break up in anarchy, that it is almost a shock to be called out by Wei Jingsheng's confident assertions. Let us rally together under the banner of democracy. Do not be fooled again by dictators who talk about stability and unity, he wrote. Fascist totalitarianism can bring us nothing but disaster. Harbor no more illusions. Democracy is our only hope. Abandon our democratic rights, and we shackle ourselves again. Let us have confidence in our own strength. We are the creators of human history. Wei Jingsheng was only 28 when he wrote the fifth modernization, but 12 years of hard living had brought him to this moment. He had grown up privileged in Beijing, the eldest child of a high-ranking Communist Party official. In 1966, Wei had become a Red Guard, embracing Mao's call for a cultural revolution. Falling foul of the struggles that broke out between different factions of the Red Guards, he went to live for a year in the province of Anhui, where his family had their ancestral home. It was there that he finally saw the devastation that had been wreaked across the countryside in the early 1960s by Mao's Great Leap Forward, a drive for rapid industrialization that led to famine and tens of millions of deaths. Like so many of his generation of urban youth, the Cultural Revolution meant the end of illusions and the dawn of cynicism about the slogans that had distorted their lives. I felt as if I had woken from a long dream, he wrote later. In 1969, as others of his generations were being sent to the countryside, his family's connections secured him a berth in the army, where, over 4 years of service, he learned more about the true state of his country. He served as a squad commander in the pitifully poor northwest of the country, where he found himself defending public granaries from starving mobs. He served side by side with peasant soldiers who told him more about the desperation of life in the countryside. On his return to Beijing in 1973, he was assigned a job as an electrician, and this was his identity when he stepped forward to Democracy Wall to post his call for China to finally stand up and claim democracy for itself. Wei Jingsheng was Democracy Wall's greatest hero, and within a year, he would become its most famous victim. In that fevered season in Beijing, there was another place in the city that was drawing people in their thousands, another sight in its own way as liberating as Democracy Wall. That autumn of 1978, an exhibition from France had opened at the National Art Museum of China. Its bland title, 19th Century French Rural Landscape Painting, gave no hint of its extraordinary impact. For us in the West, the works of the Impressionists and those who followed, modern masters such as Van Gogh and Cézanne, are so familiar that we can only connect intellectually with the shock they caused more than a century ago in Europe. But in Communist China, not only had the works never been shown before, their study had been banned. And so, by a strange trick of history, a century after these works had revolutionized Western art, they were going to revolutionize Chinese art too. Huang Rui stood in the crowded gallery. It was like being at the center of the world. Everyone he knew was there. Each day he came back to find the gallery thronged with people his age, and many like him were returning again and again. For decades, Chinese art had been so flat, formulaic and, quite the reverse of Madame Mao's prescription to be red, bright and shining, pallid. Now there were these paintings, imbued with the passion that radiated off the canvases. Huang Rui imagined that he could still smell the paint. It was a vision of another world that they had been assured could not exist. Finally, he could really see how to paint. It wasn't about mixing colors in the Russian way, blending them to a heavy darkness. It was about building up texture and depth, capturing not just the subject, but the mood. It was about touch. 35 years later, Huang Rui laughed when he described this to me and clapped his hands. The joy of that first moment of recognition was still in his voice. He had found what he'd been looking for: independence, beauty, texture, touch, and he would never forget it. A few weeks later, Huang Rui crouched over his bicycle on the outskirts of the city, breaking the law again. In those days, every bicycle in the country was registered and could be linked to its owner by a number plate. Huang Rui was furtively altering the number on his plate to cover his tracks, and with him were two friends who had done the same. They were Beidao and another poet, Manker. Over the previous 3 days and 3 nights, they had labored with 4 other friends in a run-down house on the fringes of the city, printing out the first issue of a magazine. Under a dim light with the window panes shrouded with cloth, they had cut wax stencils by hand. Painstakingly, they etched words and drawings in the wax, and then placed the stencils one by one into a levered mimeograph machine. They had squeezed the ink through the stencils, printing sheet after precious sheet, until the stencils disintegrated and the pages became illegible. Finally, they had bound 300 copies of their magazine by hand, 60 pages in total, under a blue and white cover. The title of the magazine was Today. The publication was unlicensed by any proper authority, and so illegal. Now, on December 23, 1978, they would publish it on the streets of Beijing. Just weeks before, they had still been passing their poems and stories within their group in handwritten copies to be shared and discussed within the secret world they had created for themselves during their teens. For years, they had been used to hiding in plain sight, playing the role of revolutionary youths as their cynicism deepened. Now they were going above ground. What had happened in Tiananmen Square at Qingming in April 1976 had been a turning point for all of them, yet, since the fall of the Gang of Four that same year, it felt like they had been holding their collective breath. Now that Beijing spring had finally arrived, what they were seeing at Democracy Wall spurred them on. Fresh ideas, free ideas were being posted up every day, and ordinary people were jostling to read them, and no one was stopping them. For years, the only truth these 3 held was to that which they found within themselves. Now their magazine's editorial almost shouted from the page. History has finally given us the opportunity to sing aloud the song that has been buried in our hearts for 10 years. The difficult task of reflecting the spirit of the new era has fallen onto the shoulders of this generation. What is past is already past. The future is still distant. To our generation, only today is today. Now they were ready to launch. The only way to do it was to travel Beijing and paste the magazine up page by page at key points around the city. The only transport they had was their bicycles, hence the spy craft with the number plates. They had debated whether to carry out their mission by day or by night, and had finally agreed that daytime was safer. In the dark night of a Beijing winter, it seemed more likely that one or all of them could simply be made to disappear. Despite the bravado of their editorial and the consoling light of day, they embraced each other in a farewell before they set off. On that freezing winter day, Huang Rui, Beidao, and Manker rode through Beijing, the ancient capital where they had grown up, pasting up copies of their magazine. They rode from the far east of the city, where they had printed their precious copies, to the far west where Beijing's most prestigious universities spread their campuses toward the old summer palace. They rode through a city that was almost free of cars, where snow formed drifts capped with coal dust, where they could see their breath and hear the creak of their bicycles alarmingly loud on the city's flat gray streets. From the University District, they circled down to join Chang'an Avenue, and riding east towards Tiananmen Square, they stopped on the corner of Xidan to post their magazine on Democracy Wall. Finally, they arrived outside the offices of the People's Literature Publishing House. It was the monolithic state institution which for 30 years had set the agenda for published literature in China. Today was the first unofficial literary magazine to appear in the country since the founding of the People's Republic. The next day, passers-by could read mimeographed notices standing out cheekily against the stolid gray concrete pillars of the publishing house, announcing the publication of Today and directing interested readers to Democracy Wall. A few days later, when the three friends rode their laden pedal carts up to Democracy Wall, the entire edition of 300 copies sold out immediately. Through the last days of 1978, Beidao, Huangrui, and Mengke crisscrossed the capital, checking all the places where they had posted today. Everywhere they found knots of people crowded around their pages, discussing them aloud. They had put up extra pages so people could leave their comments anonymously if they wished, but there had been no need. People talked openly because, miraculously, for those few brief months, they were no longer afraid. It was the first time they had heard their words in the mouths of strangers. It was exhilarating. For more than 10 years they had held on to the sound of their real selves, the voice deep inside of them, even as they were forced to chant slogans day after day. Theirs was a generation that had plunged from the heights of idealism, of a fervor perhaps only a teenager can feel, to the depths of disillusion. Cynicism ran through them like a scar, and yet somehow they had protected inside themselves something real. This is what they offered up in the pages of today. When these three had sat down to choose what they would publish in the very first issue of their magazine, they knew they had no right to expect it would last beyond its first printing. It was possible that they would be arrested before they ever printed a second issue. And so, for that first and possibly last edition, they each chose a kind of personal manifesto. Huangrui's was a manifesto in color. He knew he was an artist, not a poet, and his statement was the cover of today. An image of two young people breasting the tape in a race for a new world, an image rendered in the color of the boundless sky. For Mengke, his manifesto would come in the form of a poem about the transformative power of poetry itself. I am a poet. I am a rebel shadow. Let it be ripped to bits, so the blood dripping down can reflect a patch of light. I am a poet. I am the sheet of blood-stained paper. Let it be passed around and read, so that the hearts are closely linked. I am a poet. I am history's witness. Beidao's poem, The Answer, was destined to become one of the most influential in contemporary Chinese history. 10 years after it first appeared in Today, its lines would be emblazoned on students' banners as they rallied in Tiananmen Square in 1989. Beidao had written it soon after the events of Qingming, 1976. The most famous stanza of The Answer reads, "Let me tell you, world, I do not believe. If 1,000 challengers lie beneath your feet, count me as number 1001. It was a whoop of defiance that would become an anthem for a generation. His confidence in the face of the crackdown on the Qingming demonstrations in 1976 would echo again 10 years later, even as the tanks patrolled the streets of Beijing after the bloody crackdown of June 3rd through 4th, 1989. It proclaimed a belief that, in the end, however long it would take, history was on their side, on the side of the youth and those who opposed, not those who oppressed. His poem assured them that it was they who were the inheritors of China's long history, not those who ruled from the inside of the red walls of the new forbidden city, Zhounanhai. A new conjunction and glimmering stars adorn the unobstructed sky now. They are pictographs from 5,000 years. They are the watchful eyes of future generations. When the authors of today were later denounced, their work would be condemned as incomprehensible, misty, and spiritually polluting, lacking in the patriotic flourishes that the authorities deemed realistic. What the authors' critics really hated, of course, was how realistic the work actually was, how recognizable to their generation. During the Cultural Revolution, some 17 million urban youths had been sent away from their homes to learn revolution from workers and peasants in the countryside. What they learned instead was how much they had been lied to. There was no socialist utopia out there. There were no farms and factories full of apple-cheeked, smiling souls serving the revolution. Instead, there was poverty, exhaustion, frustration, and the all-too-fresh memory of famine. It was 1969 when the teenaged Beidao, Mengke, and Huangrui left Beijing to be re-educated. At the time, they knew nothing of each other, and they were bound for different places. Huangrui traveled north to the bleak expanses of Inner Mongolia, while Mengke hitched a ride on a horse cart south to the marshlands of Bayandiang Lake in the neighboring province of Hebei. Beidao traveled further south to work construction on an electrical generation plant some 300 kilometers from Beijing. But while they were away, each began to write poetry, even Huang Rui, who later gave it up for art instead, and it was through writing that they would find each other. So who were they, these three who made history in that brief Beijing spring? Beidao was the aristocrat among the three, tall, thin, and naturally serious. His upright carriage could even make his Mao-suit look smart. He had grown up within a charmed circle in Beijing, his father high up in administration, his mother a doctor. His parents had sent him to the best schools in the capital, where he rubbed shoulders with the children of the political elite. Yet, as a teenager, he chafed against his privilege. He found his prestigious school stifling, and was hopeless at the subjects like mathematics and science that they prized. When the Cultural Revolution began in 1966, he needed no persuading to become a Red Guard. He escaped school and ran wild for the next 3 years with his Red Guard troop as they scraped with other factions and rampaged through the city. He led raids on public libraries and on the homes of people who had, only a short time before, been part of the honored elite. At first, he and his friends followed the correct Red Guard line. They were there to destroy books that smacked of bourgeois liberalism, art, poetry, foreign and ancient literature. All of these should be rooted out and burnt. If they must carry things away, they should loot only books on war and revolution, choosing the kinds of titles they thought likely to meet with the approval of Chairman Mao himself. But soon Beidao and his friends found themselves searching instead for what was forbidden: Western literature in translation, or Chinese classical culture, building a secret library that they would draw on in the years ahead. Beidao was only 19 when he was sent away, and he was almost 30 by the time he broke cover with his writing in Today. But in the intervening years, he had devoted himself secretly to the vocation that he discovered almost as soon as he arrived on that desolate construction site 300 kilometers from his home in 1969, to honor the experience of his generation as a writer. Manker was born to wear a leather jacket. Unlike Beidao, who wore his Mao-suit with scrupulous correctness, Manker slouched in his, pushing his hands deep into his trouser pockets till his jackets blounced up around his waist, like Bob Dylan making his way down a windy street in New York on the famous album cover. And like Dylan, Manker was a boy from the North Country. He had been born in the industrial city of Shenyang, deep in that part of China once known as Manchuria. At the age of 6, his family moved to Beijing, but he carried with him ever afterwards something of the toughness of his hometown. Shenyang remains the capital of China's heavy industry, and it was once a real capital as well, the last base of the Manchus before they crossed the Great Wall to take Beijing and found the Qing dynasty in 1644. Manker is not a Manchu, but he has never lost the air of an outsider, nor the glamour that allowed him to wear a Mao-suit coat as if it was a flying jacket. In the Beijing marshlands, where he went in 1969 at the age of 18, he quickly gathered around him a group of exiled youths who, like him, aspired to write. Over the following years, even as they remained underground and unpublished, the poets of Beijing marshes became famous within a secret network of youngsters throughout the country who circulated poems and stories in handwritten copies. Beidao sought Manker out in those years in the marshlands, as did their contemporary Chen Kaige, who would later become one of the great filmmakers of the new generation, directing Yellow Earth and Farewell My Concubine, and winning the Palme d'Or at Cannes in 1993. In those years, all sorts of forbidden books circulated, many in translation that had, bizarrely, been authorized for private study within the Communist Party by Madame Mao herself. They were meant to stay within this charmed circle of cadres, but inevitably, they leaked out, were pirated and passed from hand to hand. Of all these books, perhaps, the most important of these exiled youths was a translation of Jack Kerouac's On the Road, and of the three friends, it was Manker who best embodied the spirit of that counterculture classic. While Beidao was a natural writer and Huang Rui was an aesthete, Manker was a born bohemian. He was the only one among them who seemed to have found something truly beautiful in exile, discovering a rough beauty in the marshlands and the villages that spoke to his native sensuality. Years later, when he wrote a novel about his experience, he called it Wild Things, puzzling readers long inured to bitter descriptions of Cultural Revolution exile with his accounts of a bucolic world of sex and misbehavior. He has never lost that slouching walk, even now when he's had a real leather jacket for more than 30 years and his hair is completely gray. His hooded, rather languid eyes have never faded, nor his outside glamour. Huang Rui, on the other hand, would have looked like an intellectual no matter how he wore his mousesuit, tall and thin, with studious glasses and a soft-covered book rolled into one of his coat's patch pockets. His suits drooped like a scholar's robe. He was the youngest of the three. He was only 16 when he went to Inner Mongolia, full of dreams of art, literature, and music. Huang Rui's dreams were secret ones that would have scared his parents. His father had studied engineering on the campus of what is now Peking University. He had had dreams, too, founding his own factory in the year Huang Rui was born in 1952, when the People's Republic was young. But in 1956, the factory had been compulsorily acquired, along with all the private property in the nation, in the year every Chinese schoolchild knows as the date on which capitalism supposedly died. Gradually, Huang Rui's father was stripped of authority, until in 1959 he was reduced to the status of a simple worker in the factory he had once owned. If ever there was a Chinese generation who was destined to dismiss the experience of their parents, it was Huang Rui's. For all that he respected his father, he would be looking for guidance elsewhere. He would seek it inside himself, in the books he discovered secretly, and in the friends he would share them with. Meeting Beidao 2 years after he was exiled from Beijing would be a turning point. In the older and more confident young man, already committed to his life as a poet, Huang Rui would recognize something of himself. They would be friends for life, and through Beidao he would meet Manker. At the time, none of the three could imagine how influential they would become. Years later, when China's most famous dissident, Liu Xiaobo, winner of the 2010 Nobel Peace Prize, was writing about what influenced him most deeply in his formative years, he cited the poetry of Beidao, Manker, and the art of Huang Rui. Despite all the ways in which they differed, on that day in 1978 when the three of them posted the first issue of Today on the gray walls of Beijing, there was one thing they all agreed on. They wanted nothing to do with politics. Their revolution would be personal. They had spent years burrowing inside themselves to find what, despite years of indoctrination, was still real. They didn't want to follow leaders anymore. They wanted to put their faith in themselves. And yet, for all that they tried to avoid politics, it would run through everything they did. Because even to attempt to avoid politics in those days was a political act, and however much they wished to avoid it, politics would find them in the end. But that was a realization that lay ahead of them. In their first editorial, they wrote, "As the dawn rises from the bloodshed, we need colorful flowers, flowers that truly belong to nature, flowers that truly blossom in people's hearts." Flowers might seem an odd preoccupation for three harbingers of the avant-garde, but these were people whose whole lives had been dominated by propaganda. Literature and art had been harnessed to it. The idea that a flower could just be a flower meant everything to them. Politics had destroyed so much of what was beautiful and splendid in their country, and, even in their short lifetimes, it had killed millions of people. Politics had sent them away from their homes in their teens, had made reading and writing dangerous pursuits, had twisted people's brains so much that they hardly knew how to recognize what was real. Today would stand against politics, because the cold fact was that politics had made a mockery of their idealism. When they had gone to the country in 1969, they had still believed in Mao and his revolution. Even Huang Rui, who nursed secret doubts, had been captivated as a child by his country's revolutionary imagery of rockets heading for the skies and trains decorated with red flags streaming into the future. All three had been Red Guards. Even Huang Rui had gone to Tiananmen Square to be blessed by the chairman in the summer of 1966. They had stood in the square under the August sun, beating the sky with their little red books. They had swayed in a sea of teenagers all dressed alike, as Mao celebrated their role in his great proletarian cultural revolution. Whatever they felt over the next 3 years of that revolution, of the pitched battles, the looting and destruction in the capital, they still went to the countryside, trusting that once there, they would find the socialist paradise they had been told so much about. But they only discovered that politics had made fools of them. Of all the events that eroded their faith in the party, few had a more corrosive effect than the strange episode known as the Lingbiao incident. A brilliant military commander, Lin Biao was a key architect of the Communist Party victory over the National Forces in the civil war that ended with the establishment of the People's Republic in 1949. He became a crucial ally of Mao Zedong and was named as his designated successor in 1969. Few figures in the party's leadership were more respected. Then, in September 1971, Lin was killed in a plane crash in Mongolia in circumstances that to this day remain a mystery. Whether he had planned to assassinate Mao and then tried to flee to the Soviet Union, the official story, or was running away because he feared a purge, the impact was devastating for the party. The first official reaction was silence, but word of that event quickly leaked over radio broadcasts from Mongolia. That was how Huang Rui found out. Listening to foreign broadcasts was illegal, so naturally he, like tens of thousands of other curious young people, did just that every night. Even as the news ricocheted around the world and the Soviet Union sent experts to their client state of Mongolia to examine the crash, no official statement came from the Chinese capital. It would be a month before party cadres around the country were called to secret briefings to be told the official story of Lin Biao's treachery, and another month before that tale was made public. The Chinese people were accustomed to political reversals of fortune. They had nodded at the downfalls of plenty of once powerful men. But Lin Biao, as they heard the news for the first time, almost every one of them had a little red book in their pocket. And now they were being asked to believe that the person who had assembled that Bible, the man whose name and words were on its frontispiece, was a traitor. And not just a traitor, but a man who had chosen the hated Soviet Union as his refuge. Over the years following Lin Biao's fall, the Chinese government would try again and again to massage this story to make it more plausible and less damaging. Later, they would find Lin a convenient scapegoat for all sorts of excesses of the revolution. But for many ordinary Chinese, the fall of Lin Biao was the end of innocence and the beginning of cynicism. In the poor southern province of Guizhou, the students at the local school in the small town of Duyin had grown used to being asked periodically to hand in their history textbooks to their teachers and have them returned a little later with pages missing. Down there they had no money for new books, and so page by page they saw hero after hero ripped from the official account. "We saw Marshal Peng Duhai and Deng Xiaoping removed this way," one of these students recalled later, "and then President Liu Shaoqi. But then we were asked to hand up our books to remove all traces of Lin Biao." He told me that the moment when he ran his finger down the ragged inside spine of his textbook, from which his teachers could no longer be bothered to even remove the pages neatly, was the moment that he decided he would never again place faith in official history. The student's name was Guo Jian, and we will meet him later in this story. In the autumn of 1971, as the Communist Party cleaned up after the Lin Biao incident, they probably did not recognize how deeply the event had wounded them. Madame Mao rallied her fellow members of the Gang of Four into a campaign to criticize Lin Biao and criticize Confucius, and the population seemed to respond. But under the surface flowed a new mood, one that would explode at the Qingming incident in 1976 and then find full expression at Democracy Wall. Years later, the now imprisoned dissident and Nobel Peace Prize recipient Liu Xiaobo would remember the Lin Biao incident as the moment when his generation first began to think for themselves. On the day before Beidao, Huang Rui and Meng Ke rode through the streets of Beijing, posting copies of Today on the city walls in December 1978. The Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party concluded a key meeting in the capital. Deng Xiaoping had finally triumphed, clearing the way for his grand experiment in the reform and opening up of China. His ascendancy had been given a major push by events at Democracy Wall. The fervor could have been made for him. Posters were denouncing his rivals and calling for the rehabilitation of his allies. Democracy Wall also demonstrated what he had been arguing behind closed doors, that the country was ripe, indeed clamoring for change, and something must be done to harness energies that could run out of control. Since his return to Beijing in 1977, Deng had pushed for the rehabilitation of exiled and imprisoned intellectuals and officials, not just those who had suffered during the Cultural Revolution, but also those whose persecution dated back as far as 1957, when Mao had cracked down on a period of open liberal debate by launching the anti-rightist campaign. Deng was looking to gather around him the kind of people who could implement his pragmatic vision for the future of China. He saw a path to recovery for China in opening up to Western know-how and technology. He had seen during his time in the countryside what could be achieved by granting some level of autonomy and personal responsibility. Deng was no Democrat, and he would have been appalled by some of the sentiments being expressed at Democracy Wall. But when the United States reporter Robert Novak asked him in November 1978 for his opinion of what was happening there, Deng endorsed it, knowing he was sending a message. He had a date with President Jimmy Carter in January 1979, and he had no intention of spoiling the image of the newly open society he planned to promote. The United States should have no fear of sharing its expertise, its university places, and its money with China. When his remarks to Novak reached people at the wall, the news was greeted with wild cheers, even though Deng had also cautioned that he did not personally agree with all that was being said there. That night, thousands marched from the wall to Tiananmen Square in triumph, chanting, "Long live the people! We want freedom! We want democracy! Carry forward the April 5th movement." The April 5th movement was the label the Democracy Wall activists gave themselves as inheritors of the spirit of the Qingming demonstrations 2 years earlier. Deng would ride the energy of the witness of that day and use their passion at Democracy Wall while it suited him. Later, he would put them down without compunction. It is now commonly said that it was Deng Xiaoping who sparked China's modern reforms. But there is an argument to be made that the biggest push for change came not from above, but from below. As Liu Xiaobo wrote on the 30th anniversary of the events at Democracy Wall, people like Meng Ke and Beidao changed China by galvanizing the latent energy of the population. These spontaneous popular forces for reform, he wrote, were rooted in the human longing for freedom and justice, not some slogan of the rulers, and once they got going, they were hard to turn around. Now firmly in control of the government, Deng honed his message and used it to marshal confidence in his new policies. He endorsed an old slogan of Mao's which was itself taken from a traditional Chinese saying dating back to the 1st century. As they plotted their path into the future, Deng said the Chinese should seek truth from facts. This slogan would become his mantra, repeated endlessly to indicate that pragmatism, not ideology, was now the watchword. As a slogan, it did not soar, but it worked. For farmers around the country, it promised a return to some autonomy, and over the following decades, it would revolutionize their lives. To technocrats and intellectuals, it seemed to say that in the future it might, in an old inversion of the old Maoist phrase, be better to be expert than read. And for a while it chimed with the people at Democracy Wall, too, the poets and the artists of today, and the bolder aspiring reformers such as Wei Jingshen. For wasn't that what they themselves were doing, honoring what they believed to be true, rather than the received truth of ideology? And for the 17 million young people who had been sent to the countryside during the Cultural Revolution, it seemed to promise a return to normality, a chance to come home and get on with a life they could choose for themselves. For some, it would even promise a chance to go abroad. As Deng got on the plane to the United States in 1979, Huang Rui and his friends were determined to push things as far as they would go. For Huang Rui, that meant seeking out a band of brothers who could do for art what today had done for literature. For now, his painting of liberty, his secret tribute to the spirit of Qingming 1976, was hidden under a sheet in his bedroom. But its time was coming. Chapter 3. The Stars. On the first day of 1979, a joint communique established full diplomatic relations between the United States and the People's Republic of China. The détente reached between President Nixon and Mao Zedong in 1972 was bearing fruit under the presidency of Jimmy Carter. On January 28th, Deng Xiaoping boarded a plane for the United States. His visit, so vital to a strategy of securing American knowledge and investment, was a resounding success. A series of powerful images defined Deng Xiaoping's trip. Deng applauding the Harlem Globetrotters at the Kennedy Center. Deng admiring the astronaut training facility at NASA. Deng chatting amiably with President Carter and former President Nixon at the official reception at the White House. Deng had insisted that Nixon be invited to the party, and the sight of him at ease with two such powerful figures enhanced the message of his ascendancy back home. But the moment that captured the most attention in both countries was when the diminutive Deng, who was only 4 feet 11 inches tall, donned a huge Texan hat at a rodeo outside Houston. There was something about the ease of the gesture, His ability to have fun was something that could have made him look ridiculous, that confirmed him as being both comfortable with the West and effortlessly in charge. Today, visitors to the National Museum of History in Beijing will search in vain for any meaningful mention of the Cultural Revolution or the Great Leap Forward, but they will find, in its own sealed display case, that Texan hat. For President Carter, though, it was Deng's performance behind closed doors that left the deepest impression. At a specifically convened private meeting, Deng coolly outlined China's plan to launch a military strike against Vietnam. He was dispensing with the decades of mistrust, taking the United States into his confidence and inviting its tacit support for what he believed was a common goal, to curb Soviet influence in Asia. China had always regarded its fellow communist state of Vietnam as a little brother, but a series of incidents had soured their relationship. Incursions into China along their common border were increasing, and ethnic Chinese in Vietnam were being expelled from the country. In late 1978, Vietnam shocked China by signing a treaty with the Soviet Union, and a month later compounded their offense by invading Cambodia, a regional ally of China. Vietnam argued that the invasion was imperative in order to oust Pol Pot, whose genocidal regime had turned Cambodia into a charnel house and was threatening Vietnam's own security. But to China, the Vietnamese action was brazen interference by a Soviet pawn in China's sphere of influence, part of a Soviet plot to encircle China from the south. Deng told Carter that China planned a limited punitive campaign to pull Vietnam into line. Carter, just 3 years on from the United States' humiliating withdrawal at the end of the Vietnam War, counseled Deng about the dangers of a military and public relations calamity. But he stopped short of opposing the plan outright, and Deng flew out of Washington determined to go ahead. The Army was his power base, and he was concerned at how much its involvement in the 10 chaotic years of the Cultural Revolution had cost it, both in training and respect. It was a long time since it had mounted a serious military campaign, and Deng thought that the action in Vietnam would give the Army a chance to come back into its own. It proved to be a massive miscalculation, one of the few that Deng was to make during his time in power. On February 17, 1979, waves of Chinese troops crossed the border into Vietnam, attempting the kind of shock and awe that had served them so well, if so bloodily, in the Korean War 29 years before. But China's tactics failed to draw the Vietnamese army north to fight, nor did the Vietnamese command move any of their forces out of Cambodia. Instead, battle-hardened Vietnamese militias mauled the Chinese, using the guerrilla tactics they had perfected in their long wars with the French and the Americans. Within days of the invasion, both sides had suffered heavy casualties. By the time China began to withdraw on March 6, they had neither forced Vietnam out of Cambodia nor demonstrated China's military superiority. The main phase of the war was over within a month, but the border skirmishes would continue for the best part of a decade. Before hostilities formally ended in 1989, thousands of Chinese soldiers would lose their lives and tens of thousands would be injured. China's official announcement of the conflict was only made once China's troops had completed their withdrawal on March 17th, and foreign journalists found themselves scrambling for information and seeking out any sources with Army connections. The Democracy Wall activist Wei Jingshan was one, and he happily shared what he believed to be common knowledge with at least one journalist. It was a decision that would cost him dearly. In early 1979, the voices at Democracy Wall were multiplying and organizing, even as rumors of a crackdown began to spread. When Deng Xiaoping returned to China, the wall was barely 3 months old, but already dozens of unofficial magazines and several other walls acting as platforms for dissent had appeared around the country. While Today remained strictly a literary magazine and avoided political discussion, many of the new publications were different. A friend of Huang Rui by the name of Liu Qing published April 5th Forum, which adopted the stance of a respectful advisor to the government. Liu believed that they had Deng Xiaoping's support and advocated a gradualist approach to political change. Wei Jingshan had no time for gradualism. In January 1979, he launched Explorations, which was by far the most radical publication to appear at Democracy Wall. The journal posed deep and uncomfortable questions. Why was China still so poor despite 30 years of communism? Why were women so exploited? Why were there so few opportunities for ordinary people to live a meaningful life? And in a provocative foray into investigative journalism, Wei published an expose of conditions at China's most infamous political prison, Qingchen. Nobody who was in Beijing during that extraordinary year of 1979 has ever forgotten it. The universities, which were deserted wastelands during the Cultural Revolution, had come alive again,